everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic podcast. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and joining me today for a special edition, pre-election edition, is my brother, Mark Zeldin. Mark, why don't you, hello, first of all, good to see you.
Hey, Kale, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Indeed, indeed. Why don't you tell us a little bit about just a quick background, just sort of, why you and I are going to be talking about this upcoming election in just a few
Yeah,
hours here.
right. So obviously, the elections and what's likely to transpire on Tuesday and beyond, there's a lot of different issues. There's the historical context, there's electoral politics, there's
Mhm.
policy implications, Republicans and Democrats. But also, like, what are the implications for faith-based institutions and individuals, right? And
Great.
people who are motivated by faith. So, there's a number of different things I think that'll make the conversation of great interest to your viewers and listeners.
Great. All right. Well, let's just start off with the races themselves. You follow this as sort of part of your work, is what you do. What races are you looking at? Like, what are you sensing? Why is this going to be an historic moment, do you think?
Yeah. Well, it is. I think it's got the ability to be more consequential than 2010,
Okay.
and arguably as consequential as 1994 from an electoral politics part, right? We
Okay.
don't, we'll prognosticate about what it means for policy implications and history and those things, as we go along.
So what were
But
those? What were those? So you referenced 2010 and 1994. What happened then?
yeah, so 1994, I think, is certainly in our lifetimes probably the most consequential midterm election.
Yeah.
The Democrats had held unbroken control of the U.S. House of Representatives for 40 years at that time. Senate, most of the 40 years, with a few interludes, Republicans had control. So it was a consequential in the sense that Democrat control of Congress had shifted in a historical way. There was also a significant amount of policy actions that flowed from that.
Right.
So I think that's what makes that election probably from a midterm perspective the most consequential of our lifetime.
Right.
2010 was also consequential for similar reasons, but the Republicans had not gained control of the Senate. They did gain, I think, a half a dozen or more seats, but numerical control continued with the Democrats. And I think that mattered for some of the pen and phone issues with Obama and executive orders that we
Okay.
discussed in our previous call.
Right.
Well, that's
Exactly.
why I think this has the opportunity to be more consequential, just from a numbers, the electoral victory of one side over the other.
Okay. Okay. So, all right. So, you sort of in that sort of context, then, what do you see happening, and maybe, in addition to sort of what do you see happening, what is driving it from your perspective as a long time sort of,
Yeah.
I don't mean this denigrating, but as a long time Hill rat. I mean, you've seen a ton of stuff. So, what's
Yeah.
driving? What are you seeing, and what's
Yeah. I
driving it?
mean, anytime you look at a map, whether it's a midterm map or presidential map, and this goes for 2012 and 2016, even this is very recent, and large parts of the map vote you're pretty confident, that large parts of the country are going to vote a certain way.
Right.
There's obviously certain parts of the country though that do tend to go back and forth. So I think from a voter standpoint, electoral coalitions aren't static, right? When you read history, and we can look back and we can see. I mean, I think things do move faster now than they did perhaps a generation or two ago. But when you see these coalitions, you saw since the election of President Trump in 2016, you saw a continued shift of more affluent zip codes, people that likely have college degrees or even graduate degrees, more often than not white or ethnics, who were trending away from historical Republican tendencies towards Democrats.
Right.
And that, if that had not been paired with any other changes in different blocks of voters, that would have been pretty harmful for Republicans and certainly beneficial for Democrats. But what we're seeing, and what you and I discussed a little bit on the last podcast back in September of last year, was Hispanic voters, especially to a certain extent, blacks and especially black male voters, starting to trend towards President Trump and Republicans in 2020. I think one of the questions was, would that continue without Trump on the ballot? Right? Is that just kind of a one-off thing? And it seems pretty obvious to anybody that pays attention to polling and trends over the last 2 years that that's only heightened. And I think what you're seeing Hispanic voters, especially, and all over the country, not narrow to South Florida, for example, right, or South Texas, but all over the country, paired with more affluent, college-educated voters who do have a history of voting Republican over the last generation or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, going back to sort of historical trends. Again, not all of them, and not
Yeah.
unanimously,
But
but
it doesn't
people
need
that
to
are
be a
comfortable
ton.
that way.
It doesn't need to be a ton of numbers to be
Correct.
consequential
Oh,
electorally. Yeah.
it can be five. If
Right.
it's 5% of these more affluent voters in some of these more blue-oriented states and affluent zip codes, 5 to 10% go from voting Democrat to Republican. Yeah, it's significant, and I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it in New Hampshire, right? We're seeing it in
Okay.
New York State. We're seeing it in Rhode Island, where you are.
Right.
We're seeing some of those areas where again, these coalitions aren't static. So you've got higher percentages of working class voters, especially Hispanic, but certainly Black males, it looks like as
Right.
well, coupled with some of these more affluent constituencies trending back. So when you put that together, it looks to be good news for the GOP and quite negative for Democrats and the current leadership in Washington, D.C.
So, one of the, I follow this stuff probably not as acutely as you do and have to, right? Just professionally. What struck me the other day is I saw a poll that has not only DeSantis of the governor of Florida projected to win pretty big, but what really blew me out of the water was the fact that he is now polling ahead even in Miami. Like,
Yes.
like that is that's a pretty shocking turn of events, right? I mean, especially,
Yes.
after all, this is the man that was called Death Santis,
Right.
Trump 2.0, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
all those kinds of things. And so what do you make of that as someone
Well,
involved?
I think there's a couple of parts to that, right? And how Hispanic voters in South Florida, again, we tend to think of them like Cuban expats and they're
Right.
Republican and
But it's
conservative.
not.
That subgroup is historically more Republican, but there's all sorts of people from Central America, South America, especially people, Afro-Caribbean voters,
Yep.
who are not part of that.
Right.
I think it's a couple fold. I think one is, I think there's an understanding that before the pandemic, the economy was good,
Yeah.
and
Right.
there were jobs and there were opportunities, especially in these populations that are more working class,
Right.
right? When you look at it, if you line up 1,000 Hispanic voters around the country, they're overwhelmingly skewed to working class, some middle class, and a very modest percentage of college graduates and white collar professionals, right?
Yeah.
So these issues that are in play from the economic standpoint impact those populations more, regardless of their ethnicity, right?
Right.
Or
Right.
what part of the country. Paying a couple of $100 more for fuel, a couple of $100, $300 more for food a month definitely impacts a working class person more. So I think part of it's economics,
Right.
unquestionably, and probably the largest part of it's economics. But I think a substantial part of it can't be discounted, and the Washington political class will work hard to discount it, and that is the cultural issues that have that you and I and a lot of people, the Americans conservative that are part of active viewers and readers of Americans have known for a long time.
Right.
But I think for a lot of regular voters, pornography for elementary school kids, right?
Right.
Genital mutilation for young people that are in young teens or even preteens,
Right.
without parental notification, being paid for with taxpayer dollars. I think those sorts of things with parents with their school age children. I think that is a substantial part of why they're going to get it. We'll talk a little bit about Michigan too,
Yeah.
and why that's
Yeah.
relevant, because you've got Islamic populations that have traditionally voted Democrat in places, especially in Michigan,
Right.
who are seeing this in the schools and saying, wait a minute, what? And they're like, no,
Right.
wait, who's doing this? Oh,
Yeah.
these are Democrat union people and people that I've generally voted for. So you're seeing, I don't want to discount the significant impact that culture has. And these are people who can't just, well, I'm just going to send my kids to private
Right.
school.
Right.
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 They just
Right.
don't
Right.
have the means typically, or the knowledge or the wherewithal, because generally speaking, they're more recent arrivals to the country and just don't have the social capital of people whose families may have been here from, 3, 4, 5 generations.
Yeah, I'm struck by this sort of the twin pinchers of economics and culture. It's like I feel like with one of those things, you can, if one of those things is sort of going swimmingly, you have the kind of luxury to ignore the other one, right?
Yeah.
But when you know, well, like take for inflation, for instance. I mean, we've been told for a long time now, going on, gosh, about a year, that inflation was not real, that it was not true, that this was sort of a
Transitory.
right. This is sort of a quick come and go, and the pandemic's been tough, so da da da, Trump, blah, blah. But but the part that really struck me, Mark, and I do the like our own dad, like I do the grocery shopping in the family, and like
Yeah,
I could fill up a cart, let's say a year and a half ago, and the groceries might run me $200. I fill up that same cart today, same groceries,
yeah,
the
yeah.
same actual stuff I stick in my fridge and stick in my pantry, and now that $200 grocery bill is $350 now. I mean, like
Right,
really. Um,
right.
and so being told, I think for a long time that was just not true was the disconnect. I felt it very acutely. Gas, of course, is another thing,
Yeah.
et cetera, like all those
Well,
things, right?
heating oil, like
Heating
heating
oil,
oil
right?
prices where you are in the Northeast.
Yeah,
I mean, that 40, 50% more just since last winter,
right.
you
So
know.
so that so to me, being you know toyed with, the sort of the being toyed with by the sort of the people who run the narrative, is annoying, right? But as
Yeah,
conservatives, I think people like you, me, I think we're used to that sort of thing, and so we
yeah,
always sort of listen to the news with a
yeah,
certain amount of
yeah.
skepticism, right? Like,
Yes,
okay, like
yes.
we know how to shade
Right.
a headline, like we know, we're very familiar with the conservatives pounce or Republicans
Yes,
pouncing, that
right.
kind of garbage, but
Unexpectedly,
right,
right?
right. So we can kind of you sort of have a sort of a tolerance for that. But
Yes.
the economic issues now twinned with the cultural issues that you all saw. You're in Northern Virginia, and
Yeah.
you all saw that with your governor's election this last time. That
Yes.
that really so much of that needle was pushed by not like quote unquote angry white people,
Right.
but really with frustrated um, middle and upper middle class parents of kids who went to public schools, a lot of which were, brown and black people.
Yes.
Shockingly, yellow, brown, and
Yes.
black people also
Right.
don't seem to like
Right.
being told that they have no right to raise an objection to, affirming care, as the euphemisms go.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated, and I wonder how you see this, like how both of these things are really working sort of with the sort of the normal, maybe the normal
Yes.
course correction with a midterm election with a new president. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah. No, look, we talked about this on the last podcast as well, right? About how the day that President Trump got inaugurated, there was hundreds of thousands, or at least I don't know how many, tens of thousands of angry, mostly white women with those pink pussy hats, enraged about
Right,
President Trump. Right,
right.
clearly manufactured. You couldn't. I mean, I understand that they were angered at the thought of him being
Yeah,
president. I
yeah, yeah,
understand
yeah,
that.
yeah. But he literally hadn't
But
done anything at the point.
right. But what we're seeing here is, and this is where the many disconnects between the political class, whether it's in Washington or just around the country, is regular people that don't watch news daily, or they don't really
Yep.
consume, or they're certainly not focused on national issues. They may be their local, broadcasts and things of that sort.
Yeah.
It does take time. It takes time for things to sink in. That's not a criticism. It's just, when gas goes from $2.35 a gallon to $3.75 or
Yeah.
$4 here in Northern Virginia at the time, it didn't happen overnight. Right. So it takes
Right.
time, right? And it takes time for that to seep in. Now, gas and food prices are kind of, people do feel it. You can't gaslight it. They're trying, but they
They're
can't do
trying.
it. On some of these cultural things, we live one county over from Loudoun County.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And we had no idea
Yeah.
that boys were identifying as girls, as teenagers, and raping
Yeah.
them in bathrooms, and the school systems were covering that up. I mean,
Yeah.
until that really broke, I had no idea. And we lived, maybe 15 miles
Right.
from there. So once that seeps into the consciousness of regular people, again, people that don't write for a living, or that they're just
Yeah.
not part of their lifestyle, and what they do for a living is it just takes longer to absorb these things and get them. But boy, once you absorb them
Yeah.
and you get them, and you're able to make clear delineations about like what's going on. People can talk all day long about these transgender issues and compassion, and most all of us have some empathy for people.
Of course.
I think there's a lot of mental illness, but when you're talking about sexual assault and rape of teenagers and not telling the parent and covering it up, I think people don't get how that just how over time that seeps in, and it really angers people. And once they understand who's doing it and who's potentially trying to stop it, then you gravitate to that, notwithstanding whatever your family's history is, right?
Right. Because here's the thing, because as a parent, you and I both know this, like we already feel somewhat helpless, right? I mean, we're trying to parent in the age of cell phones. We're parenting in the age of confusion, et cetera, et cetera. So we already feel somewhat out of control, right?
Yes.
But I think the story. So I think the story diagnoses the problem, to sort of borrow a phrase from somebody, right? It's like that story in particular. So if you recall the sexual assault, it was actually this guy
multiple.
Did this, right?
Yes, yeah.
And so when the dad found out, was horrified naturally.
Yes.
He goes to the school board meeting and quote unquote causes a scene. Now, you and I, of course, I think would similarly cause a scene if our daughter was sexually assaulted in the bathroom and we weren't told about any of it. We were being lied to. Okay, so the guy goes up, causes a scene. Now, if you remember the framing of this event in the news, I just want for our audience to remember. The framing of the event was that an unhinged MAGA dad goes and complains because his child has to learn, it's something about something anti-racist. Right? Okay. Now we know the true story. The true story is the dad found out that his daughter had been sexually assaulted, but the framing of it was so cynically done on the part of the media curator, the narrative curators, that once the truth of it comes out, it's like, oh my gosh, they're lying to us on multiple levels here, and they're robbing me of my agency as being a parent, as a dad.
And imagine if you're a fully integrated person in the political class and that happened, it would still, but in that case, he apparently tried to work through the proper channels, and then they weren't going to let him do it. And, what I've thought about that, and I suspect you have and others, is surely people that are ideologically motivated Democrats in Northern Virginia, right, are part of the swamp. Surely there's got to be some conversations privately is this really are we really I've got several business partners that are Democrats, and one of them was like, we got those votes anyway, right?
What are you doing?
Really Machiavellian and cynical, right? He's like, why are we continuing? He's like, no one wants their second or third grader, or probably even in high school, to have pornography with their kids at school. Why would you push that issue, right? What is he's just looking at it from a raw electoral politics.
Right.
And when they lost last year in Virginia, you would think that there would be some reflection, right? But look, this goes back to Trump's election in 2016, right?
Right. I think the pattern holds. Good. I want you to draw this out, because I think the pattern holds. There's this sort of almost mini half beat of a second where they're like, are we the baddies? No, we can't possibly be the baddie, right?
So they're deplorable. Right. Yeah. I mean, so look, at some point when we're really old men, if we can make it the way the actuarial tables say, and we look back to 2016 especially, the thought was, okay, again, I said this earlier, the election map from 2012 to 2016, right? If you look at it, 90 to 95% of it is almost exactly the same.
Right.
There's a string of counties in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Iowa, and Minnesota that voted for Obama both times, or at least in 2012, and voted for Trump. The Democrats did not have to go all over the country to figure out. It was a very narrow. And historically, you would have gone and looked and talked to those people and said, all right, well, what did we do? Or what did we do wrong? Why did you vote for Obama and now you're voting for Trump?
Well, the only possible answer is they became raging racist white supremacists in the span of 2 years. I mean, that's the only. Cut that straight line, Mark. You just get right to it, right?
Right. But the fateful choice was to look honest and be inward, which can be painful and difficult. We know this as parents, as a mature adults.
Yeah.
That's the difficult choice. Or you can conjure up ridiculous things about Russia and all this other stuff, and then think that like later on, like 2020, for example, and later, that the other side of the political aisle may look at what you did and go, well, you know what? They never conceded that election. They still don't believe that Trump got elected. Well, I got a lot of questions about the 2020 election. Oh, no. You're going to be throttled. You're going to be banned.
Right.
And at some point, you just can't keep a lid on that. You could try, but you can't. And I think that's apparently they got beat badly in Virginia last year. They're going to get beat poorly, and we'll talk about my specific projections before this podcast is out. And you wonder, okay, how many times are you going to get beat where the map is where Trump started is totally redrawing the political map that you could be in a minority for a decade or more? Like at what point are you like, yeah, I want gay porn for second graders. I'm willing to lose elections over that. You know, like you wonder, right?
Right. Well, my question on that, is there's going to be some kind of correction, but the problem here, Mark, is that, unlike say in the 90s, when you see this sort of wave election, 1994, you have in which you had a political establishment that was basically like center left liberal.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You worked here then. I mean, you worked in the district. Sorry, and I remember you telling me the stories, like even like the guys that I'd see like on national news, they're like, oh, yeah, he's kind of a good guy. I mean, he's sort of playing to his constituency, but he's basically like a kind of down the center, leaning left sort of guy. We have a political class now and a leadership class now that has been pretty seriously radicalized, certainly relative to the way they were in the 90s. And so, the reason why I'm not like sanguine exactly about the future here is that I don't know. I mean, if they flipped out with the ascendancy of Trump in 2016 and sort of went to this whole Russia business or whatever, like what is going to happen on Tuesday and Wednesday? I really,
it's going to be interesting.
Well, okay, right, because you're going to have an entire political commentariat class that is going to be struggling, I think, because our democracy, capital O, capital D, is obviously in peril. And it's okay. So let's just go then. Let's go to the election. What's going to happen?
Yes.
What is your sense?
All right. So look, if the last couple of weeks play out for the next handful of days until
trends, you're talking about trends here.
There's only one race that I've seen of any consequence that has not trended in the Republicans' favor or certainly in the lead. One, the governor's race in Pennsylvania. Right. That's it.
Right.
Every single other important election in every state, whether it's Senate, whether it's governor, whether it's U.S. House, almost every single one has trended in the Republicans' direction. The New York Times and Siena and Marist polls, which were off by 6 and 7, sometimes 8 points in 2020, are trying to put these polls out, right, to kind of prevent certain people from jumping out of buildings, right?
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, I said last September on our last podcast that I thought the Republicans would be +3 in the Senate, in large part because the map, wasn't very few
favorable.
Targets, right?
Favorable,
and then +30 in the House, and there was a certain time in the summer where after the Dobbs decision,
I remember this. We were told that the Democrats were rallying.
Where typically these polls, people typically don't make up their minds until after Labor Day firmly. A lot of people. What happened was Democrat constituencies and Democrat-leaning voters were more engaged at that initial point when Dobbs happened.
Right.
Of course, what has transpired since is they've realized that it doesn't make abortion illegal. It depends on what state you're in.
Right.
And it doesn't ever do it 100%. But also inflation, all these things, home heating oil prices, people buying in New England, even in places like that. So I've never really wavered from that position. I hedged a little, I think is a fair way of putting it in August at one point, but I just think the fundamentals are right. So I think +3 is low. I think what's going on in New Hampshire in that Senate race where the Republican candidate who was totally shunned by the DC Republican political class after his primary victory in 2013 in September, who was supported by Trump, by the way, and who defeated a pretty consequential member of the New Hampshire legislature. Everybody in DC wrote him off. Everybody.
Right.
Now, I didn't. In fact, I've got a wager with a friend at a stake at Morton's and I didn't know who the guy was. I didn't know who Bolduc. I have no idea. What I do know that is that the Democrat incumbent Maggie Hassan won by 1,000 votes in 2016.
1,000. 1,000. Right? Like that is nothing.
Yeah, I mean, Trump lost, I think, by 1,200. Something like that.
Right.
New Hampshire's probably, if you talk to pollsters, probably the most schizo state.
Yeah.
I mean, it literally flips back 5 and 10 points within months, not election years, but like even within months, right?
Yeah.
So I just thought if the trends and the fundamentals are the way that I see them, I think you got to have New Hampshire in the conversation, right?
Okay.
I was still not certain, but it looks like this week Bolduc is clearly ahead. And look, if you're an incumbent, you're down 47-45, less than a week before an election, in a state that doesn't have early voting much. It doesn't really have mail-in voting, kind of more old school in that sense.
You mean it's the Jim Crow North then, obviously.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Just want to make sure I'm keeping score, right?
New Hampshire actually believes in election day.
Right? What is that? What is that?
Right. So that'll be a race that'll be pretty early. You can get a sense, like if Bolduc does what the polls are saying and wins, then you can say, okay, New Hampshire voted, I think 55 or 56% for Biden. I'd have to go back and look at the exact numbers. So you can pretty much look at that and go, okay, any state that has a competitive election that's less than 56%, say, then there's always individual trends within the state, right? Is it an incumbent? In this case, in New Hampshire, it is an incumbent, right?
Yeah.
Is just what's the Republican candidate's background? Is a good candidate, he or she a good candidate? I mean, there are certain variables on the margins, but you're going to see. I think +4 now is not a slam dunk, but pretty clear. And then you start looking at like Real Clear Politics, which is a very good site. And yes, conservative, but I think most people would say very fair and even-handed. They've moved the Colorado race and the Washington State Senate races to toss-ups.
I can't believe Washington State. Like that's
that's not a purple state.
Yeah,
that is not.
It's not.
I mean, it's not. And the incumbent hasn't done anything controversial. Patty Murray's a leftist and a liberal, but she's not. I don't know any scandals that I'm aware of, or anything like that. So when you start looking at those, +4 in the Senate is consequential. And I will add. New Hampshire Senate race is more significant than New Hampshire in a gain for the Republicans. I mean, it is all those things. But you've got, I don't know the exact numbers, you've got of the 33 or 34 senators that are up in 2024, I think 23 or 24 are Democrats. Almost half the Democrat senators are in that one class.
Right.
And you've got like, I think 8 to 10 that are in states that Trump carried or was within a point or less than a point. So you start, when they see New Hampshire, and believe me, if Washington State goes, you're going to have a whole bunch of Democrat senators go, do I want to keep defending 87,000 IRS agents over and over again over the next 2 years and lose? Or is it better for me to just stand down?
So that's part of your post Tuesday sort of implications. Yeah, I agree with that. I remember that you know, specifically talking about that in the aftermath of the 94 election is like all of these like longtime senators and representatives were like, I'm good, I'm done, bailing out, which then sort of opened up things even more. But anyway, so all right,
open seats matter, right?
Yes. Yeah, right, exactly.
So I'm thinking +4 in the Senate is very doable. I mean, that is not pie in the sky whatsoever. It could potentially even be one less. It might actually be more.
Yeah.
You in the House races typically congeal later. I don't know why. They just do. Statewide races, you get a little bit more. There's more polling. There's generally more attention paid to them.
Yeah.
House races generally congeal later. A couple things to look at in the House is, one, you could read stories about where Democrat allies and Democrat super PACs are spending money, right? And where they're going
Those
to
are tell. So in other words, their internal polling suggests that, hey, we need money here, or we don't need money there, or that kind of thing. Okay. Yep.
Yes. So when you look at that, the Democrats are in New York State.
What?
They're in Rhode Island. They're in New Hampshire. They're in California. They're in Illinois. Yeah. I mean, they're in states that, like it's just very telling. you've got districts. There's a really good index, Kale, that your viewers, some of them are probably familiar with. It's called the Cook PVI, Partisan Voter Index.
Uh-huh.
Charlie Cook, who's actually a native Louisiana, he's from Shreveport originally.
Oh, cool.
He's one of the old guys that was in this polling and prognostication business for Congress. He's one of the old guys, been around a long time when it was a smaller group of people. One of the things his firm has put up is called the Cook PVI. And it's basically like, whether it's a state or it's a congressional district, whatever the constituency is, whatever the previous presidential election was, right? In this case, Biden 51, Trump 47 for the popular vote, right? But you go to each state, right? And so let's say in Rhode Island where you are, let's say, I forget what Biden got, let's say he got 58 or 59%, right?
Sure.
And there's a congressional race there that's pretty competitive that the GOP has a good chance of winning, where Biden won 59% of the vote. Right. I don't know exactly, but let's just say it is. Well, that would be a PVI +8 for Democrats.
Got it.
So it's 8 points above what Biden got. Typically, those types of districts are not in play. Now, if there's somebody's scandal, right? Open seats, sometimes you can get close. But when you see, basically, what your viewers should look at is go and look at, and there are different sites where you can see it. Basically, any seat that's like Biden 55% or less, so that's +4, +5. Like basically 80 or 90% of those are going to go Republican. So when you start looking at the numbers, 30 is a low number. I mean, it really is likely to be over 40. If I had it somewhere between 40 and 50, was what I would say there, and that's really
substantial. That is
it is.
Yeah, you said midnight. I was just looking at my text history with our text history, and you said on October 19th, you said 30 plus market. That's where your number was, and it looks like those trends have essentially manifested themselves.
Yeah, I think 30 is low, and then when you look at governor's races are a little bit different than Senate races. We know that in Louisiana, amongst other states.
Yeah.
I think there are certain governor's races that are more important than others, and this isn't to belittle, states, right? I mean, like if Louisiana votes Democrat for governor, I as somebody from Louisiana would prefer our governor to be a Republican, but that's not consequential. If our distant cousin Lee Zeldin, if he wins in New York State, that's consequential.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
It's just significant beyond a governor's race. It's more important. It's New York State. If the Democrats lose the governor of Michigan, which they appear to be doing, Whitmer's running against a great candidate who everybody in D.C. said, no chance. Tudor Dixon, no chance. The Michigan party's in disarray, no chance. Minnesota governor. But you also have races like Arizona governor, right?
That's an interesting one. That's
attorney generals. Races, which is really important for people of faith and faith institutions on religious liberty. Right. Secretary of State, where these election issues with fraud and all that are important. You're going to see really what's going to be interesting for people like me that watch are going to be like, who are the Democrats that survive? Like that's going to be more of an interesting, almost in some way, almost interesting to me. Like, wow, that person survived this wave. That person's got ability. But that's
so. In other words, it's worth taking. In other words, it's worth taking a look at it because there's a sort of robustness and anti-fragility to those candidates on the Democratic side that is worth understanding.
Yes. And they don't have the maturity level, and this is where we're going to see the violence start almost right away. And in a half of 10 or 12 big cities that we saw in 2020, the violence is going to start. It won't last, but there'll be violence to start.
Where
and that's unfortunate, and it certainly won't be red state voters and red people that vote Republican aren't going to be the ones that are going to be participating. But I think you're going to see that it's going to be. I think the most interesting thing for me to watch as an observer of this is going to be how does the Washington political class and the sort of Democrat, big tech, media, deep state, how do they respond internally, right? Like, how do they, because they're going to have to deal with this, like, how are we going to proceed? And that's going to be almost as interesting to me as how the Republicans are going to deal with January 3rd when they're take over the Congress and afterwards. And of course, the other thing that's a tremendous concern to me and people that pay attention is this lame duck session. You'll have a session, they'll come back at middle of November until Christmas time with a little break there for Thanksgiving. And what types of things are done, and that could be very harmful in the long term for a lot of different people.
Well, tell me this. I mean, just I don't want to sort of put. I guess I am putting you on the spot. I mean, like, what kinds of things, um, you know, could be carted out during this lame duck session? No, with them knowing that they just got shellacked, and come January 3rd,
Yeah.
they have no literal leverage.
Right. Well, when you look at the history of lame duck sessions, the one that really stands out, and I guess in our lifetimes, is 1980,
Okay.
after Ronald Reagan won his big victory and the Republicans won a smashing election in the Senate. The Democrats did all kinds of things. It's interesting to look and see what they did.
Yeah.
They didn't really have anything to do with culture, though.
Right. Well, that was pre-culture times, right? Yeah.
Back then, those weren't salient the way they are now. I think the number one thing, I think probably the biggest threat to religious liberty and the free exercise easily in our lifetime, and I don't say this lightly, is if the U.S. Senate takes up the redefinition of marriage bill that passed the House this summer. If they take that up and pass it and send it to Biden, and he signs, which now case law, right? The
Obergefell, yeah.
And they put that in statute with they'll have some fig leaf about religious liberty, right? That
Mhm.
faith-based individuals and stakeholders will be allowed to practice their faith and think that certain behaviors are sinful, right? And not be
Okay.
second-class citizens.
Right.
But you and I both know, if you look at 2011, when the Obama administration famously said, well, we're just not going to enforce the Defense of Marriage
Right.
Act. We're just
Right.
not going to do it.
Right.
Okay. Why does any Republican who believes in the free exercise and religious liberty, why would they believe that a redefinition of marriage bill that had claims to have religious protections for individuals and stakeholders, why do they believe that those would be enforced by the Biden administration? I mean, that's not snarky. That's not in any way. That is a very reasonable question to ask. I think an honest answer is you cannot trust them. Of
Right.
course, they're going to vacate that. They're not any provisions that are supposedly a victory for religious stakeholders will not be enforced. I think what it will do is there's this issue that you and I and a lot of the people that follow the American conservative know, and there's this crash course, right, between religious liberty, the free exercise, and the cult of bodily autonomy. And this is that issue where people have to be confronted with are we going to allow the maintenance of a free exercise of religion that makes this country what it is, or key part of it, or are we just going to say no? We're just going to oversee that. So that to me is the greatest risk that we people of faith and faith individuals and institutions have, is that bill. That's one. I mean, I could go. There are other things, but that's the big one.
Okay, so you're talking about this collision course between bodily autonomy and religious liberty. What does that mean? Just a quick, like, how is that going to look?
Right. Well, some of this gets into government contracting, government grants, where the thought that, like, okay, they would be the change in marriage laws will be, overturned in most states at the time. And that wouldn't have, then that would sit, right? Like, okay, so we've got, consenting adults, so on and so forth. People that paid close attention to this said, well, wait a minute, it can't really stop there. It's likely going to go into the ability of these institutions to operate as with sincerely held beliefs, some of them that go back literally 4,000 and 5,000 years. Most people aren't thinking about that necessarily. Like, there's a block of Republican senators, I think, that believe, well, the court made that decision in 2015. A majority of the American people are sort of comfortable with the redefinition of marriage.
Right.
We're going to move forward, and hey, we're going to make sure that there are these provisions that are added to that codifies Obergefell that protect religious individuals and stakeholders. Right.
So if I understand you correctly,
that's not true.
Yeah. So my sense of it is you have perhaps a lack of faith in what that will practically mean. Okay, all right. So that's something that could happen in this lame duck session. What else? What other things could sort of happen? Because this is not the first time you brought it up to me. I'm just
well, it's just there are other things. I mean, there's an omnibus appropriations. Appropriations is really the lifeblood of the administrative and deep state.
Right.
And by doing omnibus bills instead of the individual bills, you can kind of jam stuff in. There'll certainly be an effort to spend another probably 40 or 50 billion dollars in Ukraine. There's just it's just a process that lends itself to doing things that can be of concern to people that are conservative. I don't want to get too far in the weeds about some of the specifics, but I think the redefinition of marriage issue, I think, is front and center. And it's just one of those things like, let's just get to January the 3rd, and have the least amount of damage, as possible. And then the investigations and the criminal behavior of the current administration will be looked at closely, in 2023.
Okay. So, and I think, certainly for our TAC viewers, the war in Ukraine is a big issue, and just sort of, whatever, just given another 40 billion, it's no big deal is
and no transparency or accountability, or almost none.
None. No, it's bizarre. And of course, to suggest that we're not actually in a war against Russia right now strikes me, again, an innocent bystander who teaches poetry for a living, strikes me as just like, who are we kidding? I mean, seriously, who are we kidding? This is remarkable. So, I mean, in terms of the historic nature, I mean, what do you think will then happen? Like, if the Republicans do in fact, go 30 plus, gain the Senate, have all these things. I mean, what do you think? I mean, this is not exactly okay. Well, then then everything will be fine. Like,
right?
How is it going to play out? Because as we mentioned in the first part of this podcast, you have an entire leadership class, narrative class, a media class who's not exactly going to be thrilled about this this event, right?
And they're not mentally, it seems like, not mentally prepared to understand that they've alienated large blocks of people that previously voted for them, right? We're not talking about, I mean, yes, people like me are going to continue to vote Republican and conservative, but the group of people that joined me has now been changed. I mean, the map is being redrawn in front of our eyes since Trump's election in 2016. So there's two things to look at there.
Okay.
Again, one on the Republican side, again, if they get up to 54 or 55 senators, I think Senator McConnell's 15-year tenure as head of Republicans in the Senate is going to be seriously threatened.
Wow.
I'm not sure if he'll actually be replaced by someone, but I think there'll be an understanding like, look, we're not doing
this is not your chamber anymore, Sarah.
Right. You're not right. Like, we'll allow you to finish these 2 years before your term expires, and you stand down, but like, we're not doing X, Y, and Z, right? Like that, which is consequential, right?
Yep.
So there's going to be look. They're going to have legislation on repealing the 87,000 IRS agents right out of the gate, border security measures on China. Like, seriously, like the really attack, that's going to be coming out of the House. You're gonna and things of that sort. So the border crime, immigration, IRS agent, like those sorts of things from a legislative standpoint. And then there'll be a lot of investigations, more so in the House likely than the Senate. But you'll have the Judiciary Committee, the Government Oversight Committee, and they'll ultimately they will likely impeach the Homeland Security Secretary, the Attorney General. There may be a few others, but they won't do it like. Yes, there are certain people like on the right wing squad, that on the Republican side that would say, "Hey, we should impeach him now."
Yeah, right.
And I'm sympathetic. I understand that it's clear that there's been a violation of oath and law. But I think what the leadership will do is, look, we'll get there, but we've got to use these the way that the Democrats did for Watergate, for example, right?
Yeah.
Like, you continue to have these investigations and these issues, and this information comes out. It can be very damaging. So I think. That's consequential on the GOP side.
Yeah, but they're not going to they're not going to have a sweet prime time slot like the January 6th commission. But nonetheless, it'll be annoying enough for the establishment.
And it won't go away.
Right.
And it'll keep going. So that's on the Republican side. That's substantive, right? And that's policy oriented things. That on the Democrat side, what's going to be fascinating is, Pelosi's been their leader in the House Democrats for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
there'll be a real serious battle about that. Like, who, won't be necessarily ideologically driven. It'll be more generational and like
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the Senate Democrats, right? Like I said earlier, let's say they've got 46 Senate Democrats, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got 8 to 10 of them that are in states that are up for re-election that Trump carried. And they're just watching,
Wow.
colleagues lose races that Biden won by 10, 12, 15 points.
Right.
That's going to have an interesting dynamic about how willing they are to defend the Biden-Harris administration, right? Are they going to put their ass on the line or not?
Okay.
That's
Can I ask you about that?
Then Biden and Harris. But yeah, go ahead.
That's where I want to go now. So you're going to have these senators who are going to very, very much rethink their retirement plans, right? Is what you're suggesting on the Democratic side of the aisle, if it all breaks the way that you are predicting. But just 2 days ago, our president showed up at your train station there in the district and went sort of dark Brandon 2.0. Like, honestly, Mark, just as an observer of symbol, like as an observer of set pieces, what do you make of him double, triple, quadrupling down on this stuff?
Look, Kale, from an optic standpoint, I mean, they're talking about they're suing the state of Arizona doing the border wall right before the election. You've got this trans guy. What's the guy? He's gotten to be pretty famous.
Dylan. Yes, Dylan.
Right? You're interviewing him on an issue that like really matters to a lot of voters, parents especially. Like, why highlight those, right? It just politically, why highlight this stuff? People don't really believe that the elections, like the country's imperiled if the other side wins. Now, there are blocks of voters in both parties that believe that, but most regular people don't believe that. So you do have to kind of wonder, like, I don't know. I mean, there are certain things I can't answer. Like, it goes back to my business partner, who's a good Democrat and a strong good partisan. He understands. He's like, why are we talking about these issues? We've got these voters. Like, what are we doing? So I can't answer some of that. It's going to be really interesting to see, because the vice president is so void of competency.
Right. So you've got two issues here.
Easy decision.
Right. So you've got two issues here. You've got an obviously impaired executive, right? The look at the tape. The tape is very obvious. It's very clear. The decline is real. It's serious. I haven't seen that man successfully walk off of a stage unaided in over a year, right? It is sad, but it does matter, Mark, because like we actually kind of need an executive. Okay, so his number two is impressively bad, right?
Yes.
I mean, you've seen a lot of.
I'm genuinely surprised myself. Obviously we have differences of ideologically and on issues, but I would figure that if you were an assistant DA in San Francisco, elected DA, elected attorney general, elected Senate, even in California, even in jurisdictions that are Democrat, that you would absorb things and become more aware and knowledgeable about a broad array of policy issues, so that when you become vice president, but apparently not. And I think the risk that what the smart money Democrats are probably been saying for a while is, all right, we'll get Biden to stand down, like he won't run for re-election. And then we'll just take Harris out and we'll replace her with the person that we think should be the candidate, right, in 2024. But like a lot of things that they do, they don't realize, like we talked about the Democrats killing Bork's nomination, right? Like, okay, let's move on. Like that's not how it works. You're going to have millions of Black, especially Black female voters that are a real core, the core probably.
Yeah, it's really the core. I would argue.
Furious and angry that this woman of part African ancestry, Afro-Caribbean ancestry, was unceremoniously removed.
Right.
They're not going to suddenly vote like you or me, but having large numbers of those people potentially stand down, especially in a presidential election, you're talking about reorienting a map where you've got where the Republicans have 61 senators in January of 2025, and comfortable majority in the House, where the ability to do things legislatively in the regular order, not just reconciliation, is done, that repeals things that conservatives have talked about doing for generations. And the country is going to, I don't know if the country has the political capital to sustain the violence that the left will do when they're confronted with that reality. Because the arc of history to they believe
As
in
they
the
would
arc.
say, right? They believe in the
It's
arc.
not
Yeah.
something that's just a cliche. They believe in it. So when something doesn't happen, again, there's two choices, Kale. We're going to go back to this over and over. You can look inward, and it's painful and difficult, but it's what mature people do and say, I need to change this, or I need to be different here, or this is wrong, right? That's the mature way.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can be like former President Obama and have somebody interview you in a bathtub full of milk and Captain Crunch and think, well, that's not going to have any effect later about the presidency or how people look at the presidency. It does.
Yeah.
Over time, these things do.
Yeah.
And that's what I worry. I don't worry about Trump coming back and winning. I think he will, and I think he will win. I think he will. I think he will have a statement on election night that he intends to announce on later that month at Mar-a-Lago.
Mm-hmm.
That he'll run. Ron DeSantis has already been telling donors privately, like, I'm not going to run against Trump in the primaries. I think it's really his for the doing. Imagine a scenario where you've got 10 Democrat senators standing down in states that are likely to go Republican when the Republicans already have 54 seats, say, in the Senate. And Trump's going to be the nominee, and or in an alternative scenario, whoever the Republican is a Trumpian candidate, they're going to be the president. And in January of 2025, it's March of 1933 in the United States. It's Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal people coming in and changing how the dynamic about legislation and the role between Washington and the states and the people. You're going to have not a reverse of that. That's not what I mean, but a substantial change in the role and the scope of government in a way that'll go for a decade or more, and has the potential to be more than that. And 50 years back in the day is probably more like 20 now, just in terms of time. A decade would probably be 25 years. I mean, that's consequential. And I just don't see that the opposition has the maturity level, one, just to lose, right? Like, we didn't win.
Well, that's where my snag is. Sorry,
like,
repeat yourself.
Conversation necessary to, like, okay, why did we lose? Why did these Hispanic people who have generally voted overwhelmingly Democrat for the last 30 years, and since Trump, why did that go this way? Why did Black males go from like 6%, 5 or 6% Republican to now 18, 20%? You got guys like Michael Irvin supporting Herschel Walker. I mean, like, there's a lot of things that are going on that aren't really being covered because, as you always say, rightfully, there's a narrative. It doesn't fit the narrative, so we're going to ignore it. But at some point, you can't ignore it, and that's what I see happening. And I fear for the violence and the lack of social capital that we can't handle in 1968. We just can't. Right. I don't know that for sure, but that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about too. Rod and I talk a lot about, the sort of the ties that bind and the social structures and these mediating institutions that have just been so drawn down. The social capital has been so drawn down over the course of our lifetime, Mark. That you wonder if we could sustain such a thing. You talk about 68. You were born in 69. I'm born in 73. Like, in our lifetimes, we've seen that capital draw down substantially. So I think you're right. I think that I share your concerns. Look, I would like to see the so-called red wave. I am with you. I think it is coming. I think the numbers all point in that direction. But boy, I mean, if you are a student of politics, if you are a student of these sorts of things, or of history, man, buckle up, because what we're about to live through here, is really going to be something.
Yes, it will show a lot of people that there's no arc of history. There's no end of history.
Yeah.
Robert Bork, the late Judge Bork, wrote a very powerful book. What was it? The Slouching Towards Gomorrah.
Yeah, I remember that.
This was about 1996, mid 90s, and there's something in that book that's haunted me ever since. And I've reread it a couple of times because it's very well written. It's very interesting to read these things decades later.
Yeah.
But he basically was making the point that you just did, that for generations, this country built up social capital. And then at some point, we can argue about when, but at some point before we were born, but not too far before we were born. But at some point, we stopped accumulating as a country political capital and started to draw down on it.
Yeah.
And it was Bork's opinion that at some point you draw down too far and there's nothing that unite and bind. And then, then violence and mayhem of the sort that we probably haven't even seen, certainly not even since the Civil War, potentially. And I thought, no, that can't be.
Yeah.
We're living in the age of John Paul II and the church seeming to be a certain way and just thinking, I've got that. We could count on this. It's just like, and I'm laughing, but really I'm covering tears and fear that Bork was 100% right. And at some point, when do people realize the way that you and I realize that we're kind of alone when it comes to leadership and institutions? Like there is no one that's going to be there that has our back. We've got to do it on our own. I'll finish with this. Mm-hmm. If it were any other country, I'd say, no way, it's done. A country of this sort could not sustain what's likely coming down the pike in the near future. And that's a fair assessment. But I think there is something about this country. The Japanese have this phrase, and I've been trying to look for it. I can't find it, but it's basically loosely translated. It's like America sometimes gets punched in the face, right? And they stagger for a bit, but then they kind of get their bearings and they kind of get it together. And ultimately, they do what's necessary and important and right, and they right the ship. And I'd like to think that's true. I hope that's true. I think all people of goodwill do, but I think I certainly, and I think you share that with me, that like I think Bork unfortunately was really right about that, and I just wonder what's the aftermath.
I'll agreed, and I'll leave you with this image because it's something a similarly haunting image for me. In the Aeneid, the great Roman epic of Virgil, there's a moment where Aeneas, a Trojan, is seeing the Greeks sort of file out of the Trojan horse and file into the city, and he goes to grab his weapons and his armor, and he's putting them on, and the gods say no. And what they do is, I think it's Venus actually, like she takes him up real quick, and it's described as Venus scraping away the clouds of his mortal sight, and he can see the gods themselves shaking the foundations of the great walls of Troy. And it's like, you wonder, and it's at that point they're like, in other words, dude, you got to go. Rome, you have to go found Rome. Trojans, Troy's done, right? And so just as that kind of that haunting image of the walls, the great walls of Troy being shaken at their foundation. You and I have watched these shaking foundations for essentially the entirety of our adult lives. And we know that these things have to be regenerated. And instead of being regenerated, I worry that we have a lab leak here, right? And we didn't even get a chance to talk about these calls for COVID amnesty, because I do think that has a part to play in this. Micah Meadowcroft here at TAC had a great piece the other day talking about a COVID amnesty. But I do think that there's a sense amongst the electorate that, okay, you really, really have been lying to us. And I think that the red wave is ultimately being pushed by, you've been lying to us about inflation, you've lied to us about COVID, you've lied to us about what it means to be a human person.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry we didn't get into that in more detail, but I think that's a key driver of the Michigan governor's race, especially because she was particularly pernicious and just mean-spirited in the things that she, impose on the people of Michigan. It goes back to what we've talked about this in the past, about the parallels with Hurricane Katrina, where government, in some sense, wasn't completely unreasonable to take some precautions after Katrina, like to wait a certain period of time before people could go back to their homes, right? But when they were blocked out of their homes, as I was for more than a month, and then we see elected officials like former Congressman Jefferson being escorted in by police, that double standard, it crushed local elected officials in the city of New Orleans, in metro area. It's why Governor Blanco stood down in 2007. Congressman Jefferson lost for re-election, shockingly, to Joseph Gow. So I think when you look at those things, again, there are some different variables and all, but there's certain trends that are the same. And that's what we could see now.
Yeah, because it comes down to this, like America, I do think that one of the American thing, right? If you look at the sort of the Seeds of Albion type sort of read on American history, it's like, the one thing that we always have in common is like, don't make rules for me that are not rules for you. Like, I
Exactly.
really think that that is like
Yep.
this core thing. It's like, no, some animals are not more equal than others. Like, I'm not
Yes.
going to play this game. And I
Right.
think you see this in Michigan, and I
Exactly.
think scaled out amongst the Democrats. All
Yes,
right. Well, look,
and then it takes time. It does take time for regular people for it to really seep into the consciousness, be clear and know, and then act accordingly when you vote. Yep.
and it does seem to me that we're at that kind of moment. So
Yes.
anyway,
I
Mark, well, this has been
agree.
awesome. We do need to do this more than just once a year. But this is
Yes.
fantastic, and we'll see what happens both leading up to Tuesday and in the aftermath. It really, if you're a student of these things, like I know you are, you'll be paying attention, and maybe we can have you back on so we can sort of do
Post mortem.
a post mortem, as they say. All
Yeah.
right, well, great. All right, until
Sounds
then,
good.
y'all take care. Bye now.